Ellen DeGeneres stopped mid-question, watching the 17-year-old sitting across from her struggle with something more complex than stage fright. Sophie Martinez was trembling, not from excitement, but from the kind of paralyzing anxiety that made even breathing feel like a performance. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become more than television. It would become the moment when fear met fearlessness, and one young woman learned that her greatest weakness could become her greatest strength. Nobody in that Warner Bros. Studio knew they were about to witness something that would redefine authentic performance. Not the cameras rolling, not the producers noting the unusual nervous energy in the air, and certainly not Sophie Martinez, who thought she was just there to talk about her high school drama program before giving up on her acting dreams forever. But Ellen knew. Ellen had been planning this moment for 5 weeks, ever since a letter from a drama teacher had made her call someone whose own journey from anxiety to Oscar gold could change a young woman's life. The letter was written in careful teacher handwriting. "Dear Ellen, I have a student who has more natural talent than anyone I've taught in 20 years, but she's about to quit acting because she believes her anxiety makes her weak. She doesn't know that the same sensitivity that causes her panic also makes her the most emotionally honest performer I've ever seen. Her name is Sophie, and she needs to meet someone who understands that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's superpower." But this is where the story gets extraordinary. Because Jennifer Lawrence had read that letter. Ellen had read that letter, and what they decided to do about it would transform not just Sophie's understanding of her own potential, but how America thought about anxiety, authenticity, and the kind of courage it takes to be vulnerable in public. Now, as Sophie sat in that familiar blue chair, wearing a simple sweater that her hands kept pulling at nervously, she had no idea that her acting hero was backstage, equally moved by this teenager's raw honesty. Ellen leaned forward, her characteristic energy tempered by genuine concern for this clearly struggling young woman. "Sophie, tell me about acting. What is it about performing that draws you in?" Sophie's voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely audible over the studio microphones. I love becoming someone else. When I'm on stage, I can be confident, or brave, or funny. I can be all the things I'm not in real life." The studio audience was already leaning in, sensing this wasn't typical teenage nervousness. There was something deeper here, something real that couldn't be manufactured for television. "But you're here talking to me right now. That takes confidence." Sophie's laugh was shaky, tinged with something that sounded like defeat. "Actually, Ellen, this might be the last time I ever talk about acting. I'm thinking about quitting." Ellen felt something shift in her chest. Here was a young woman who clearly had passion for performance, sitting on her show talking about giving up. "Why would you want to quit something you love?" Sophie looked down at her hands, then back up at Ellen. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had battled herself and lost too many times. "Because I have social anxiety, really bad social anxiety. And everyone keeps telling me that if I can't handle being around people, I'll never make it as an actress." The honesty of the statement hit the studio like a wave. This wasn't a polished interview answer. This was a young woman admitting her deepest fear about herself. "Last week, I had a panic attack during our school's production of Romeo and Juliet. Right there on stage in front of everyone. I forgot my lines, I couldn't breathe, and I ran off stage crying. My drama teacher says I have talent, but what's the point of talent if I can't use it without falling apart?" Ellen was studying Sophie's face, seeing something she recognized from her own journey. Someone who had been told their sensitivity was a liability instead of an asset. "Sophie, can I ask you something? When you're not having a panic attack, when you're just acting, how does it feel?" For the first time in the interview, Sophie's face lit up slightly. "It feels like I'm finally telling the truth. Like all the feelings I have inside that are too big for regular life finally have somewhere to go." Ellen felt tears starting to form. Here was a young woman who understood something about performance that many professional actors never learned, that the best acting comes from emotional truth, not emotional control. "Sophie, what if I told you that some of the most powerful actresses in the world have dealt with exactly what you're dealing with?" Sophie looked confused, hope flickering across her anxious features. Really? But Ellen wasn't just speaking as a talk show host anymore. She was speaking as someone who was about to facilitate a conversation between this struggling young actress and someone who had built an Oscar-winning career on the foundation of authenticity, vulnerability, and the courage to be imperfect in public. "Sophie," Ellen said, standing up from her chair, "there's someone here who's been listening to our conversation. Someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be anxious, to feel like your sensitivity makes you different, and to discover that those same qualities can make you extraordinary." Sophie's breath caught, anxiety and anticipation warring on her face. Someone who understands anxiety. Ellen walked toward the wings of the stage, and the studio audience began to buzz with anticipation. They could sense something significant was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellen announced, her voice carrying across the studio with unusual warmth. "Please welcome someone who has turned authenticity into artistry, Jennifer Lawrence." The studio exploded. 300 people jumped to their feet, but Ellen was watching Sophie, who had gone completely still. Her mouth fell open, her hands flew to her heart, and then she started crying. Not tears of anxiety, but tears of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Jennifer Lawrence walked onto that stage with her characteristic blend of grace and approachability, but she wasn't carrying her usual playful energy. She was carrying something more focused, the presence of someone who understood exactly what this young woman was going through. "Sophie," Jennifer said, her voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had made her beloved worldwide, "I heard you talking about anxiety and acting, and I've got some things to say about that." Sophie couldn't speak. She was shaking, but this time not from anxiety, from the overwhelming realization that her hero, the actress whose fearless authenticity had inspired her for years, was standing right in front of her. But this is where the story becomes something nobody expected, something that would change not just Sophie's perception of herself, but how millions of people thought about anxiety, about authenticity, about the difference between being fearless and being brave. Jennifer didn't sit down in the guest chair. Instead, she pulled it closer to Sophie and sat directly facing her, knee to knee, creating an intimate space in the middle of a television studio. "Sophie, can I tell you something? I have anxiety too. Really bad anxiety. I've had panic attacks on red carpets during interviews, even while filming some of my biggest movies." Sophie's eyes went wide. This was Jennifer Lawrence. Confident, funny, seemingly unshakable Jennifer Lawrence, talking about struggling with the same thing that made Sophie feel broken. "When I was your age, I thought anxiety meant I was weak. I thought it meant I wasn't cut out for this business. But you know what I learned? The same sensitivity that causes anxiety is what makes you a truthful actor. The same emotional intensity that feels overwhelming in real life is what makes audiences believe your performances." Jennifer reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Sophie gasp. It was a folded piece of paper, but not just any paper. It was a printed review of Sophie's performance in her school's production of Our Town, a review that had been published in the local newspaper months ago. "Ellen sent me this review," Jennifer said, unfolding it carefully. The critic wrote, "Sophie Martinez's performance was so emotionally honest, it was almost uncomfortable to watch. She brought a vulnerability to the role that made everyone in the audience feel like they were witnessing real life, not performance." Sophie stared at the paper, remembering that performance, one of the few times she'd made it through without a panic attack, when she'd felt completely connected to the character. "Sophie, do you know what that review is describing? That's not despite your anxiety. That's because of it. Your sensitivity, your emotional intensity, your ability to feel things deeply, that's not what's holding you back from being an actress. That's what makes you a great actress." But Jennifer wasn't finished. She looked at Ellen, who nodded, then back at Sophie. "I want to tell you about my first big audition. I was 18, going for a part in a major film, and I had such a bad panic attack in the waiting room that I almost left, but then I realized something. I could use that anxiety. I could channel that intensity into the character." Jennifer leaned closer to Sophie, her voice dropping to something more intimate. "The panic attack you had during Romeo and Juliet? That wasn't failure. That was your emotional truth being too big for the moment. But what if instead of running from that intensity, you learned to channel it?" The studio audience was completely silent, watching two actresses, one established, one struggling, connect over the shared experience of feeling too much in a world that often demanded emotional control. "Sophie, I want to offer you something. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because I recognize talent when I see it. I'm starting a mentorship program for young actresses who understand that authenticity is more powerful than perfection. I want you to be part of it." Sophie started crying harder, but these were different tears. Tears of validation, of possibility, of dreams that had seemed dead suddenly showing signs of life. "But more than that," Jennifer continued, "I want to help you get into the best acting program in the country. Not to change who you are, but to help you channel who you are into performances that could change people's lives." Ellen stepped forward, her own face streaked with tears. "You know what, folks? This is exactly why we do this show. Not just for entertainment, but for moments like this. Moments when we remember that our greatest struggles often contain our greatest strength." She turned to Sophie, who was still holding the review Jennifer had given her. "Sophie, you said you love acting because you can be confident and brave and funny. But what if I told you that sitting here today, being vulnerable and honest about your struggles, is the bravest performance I've ever seen." The show ended with Sophie, Ellen, and Jennifer in a three-way embrace, but the image that would be shared millions of times was simpler. Jennifer Lawrence, Oscar winner and global star, sitting knee to knee with a 17-year-old, both of them understanding that the best performances come from the courage to be real. 6 months later, Sophie Martinez was accepted into Juilliard's acting program, with a full scholarship facilitated by Jennifer's mentorship program. But more importantly, she was performing again, not despite her anxiety, but with it, channeling her emotional intensity into characters that moved audiences to tears. Her first college performance, a one-woman show about living with anxiety, received a standing ovation and was reviewed in the New York Times, the critic wrote. Martinez doesn't just perform anxiety, she transforms it into art, showing audiences that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the most powerful form of human connection. Jennifer kept her promise about mentorship, checking in with Sophie monthly and even attending her first college performance. "Watching Sophie embrace her sensitivity as strength reminds me why I love this craft," Jennifer said in a recent interview. "She's not acting in spite of her anxiety, she's acting because of it." Ellen keeps a photo from that day in her dressing room. Jennifer and Sophie, foreheads almost touching, both crying, both understanding that authenticity is the rarest and most valuable quality in performance. Every time she looks at it, she remembers that her platform's highest purpose isn't entertainment, it's encouragement. And Sophie, she still gets anxious before performances. But now, instead of seeing anxiety as her enemy, she sees it as her compass, pointing toward the emotional truth that makes her performances unforgettable. The sweater she wore that day, the one she kept pulling at nervously, now hangs in her dorm room closet. She doesn't wear it anymore. Not because she's ashamed of who she was, but because she's grown into who she was always meant to be. Because that's what Jennifer Lawrence, Ellen DeGeneres, and Sophie Martinez taught the world that day. That the things that make us feel different aren't flaws to be fixed, they're gifts to be channeled. That anxiety isn't the opposite of courage, it's courage with honest feelings attached. And that sometimes the most powerful performances happen when we stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. The panic attack that almost ended Sophie's acting dreams became the foundation of performances that change lives. Her anxiety didn't disappear, it transformed, becoming the source of an authenticity that audiences can't look away from. Share this story if you believe sensitivity is a superpower. Comment below if you've ever turned your struggle into your strength. And remember, the things that make you feel different might just be the things that make you extraordinary, because in the end, that's what happened in that studio that day. A young woman who thought her anxiety made her weak discovered it made her powerful, all because another woman who had walked the same path chose to light the way forward. The fear that Sophie carried into that studio became the courage she carried onto stages across the country. And that transformation proves that sometimes our greatest weakness is just our greatest strength waiting for permission to shine.